I walked into my kitchen after a 12-hour shift, and before I could even take off my boots, my wife screamed, "What the hell did you do to our money?" For a second, I honestly thought somebody had died. Karen stood near the kitchen island in gray yoga pants and one of those oversized sweaters she liked buying from boutiques at the Green Shopping Center. Her face was red. Emily stood beside her, holding 3 credit cards in one hand and her phone in the other, like she was about to record a hostage video. Outside dirty February, snow sat in uneven piles along our driveway in Dayton. My lower back hurt from climbing around forklifts all night at the warehouse, and all I could smell was burnt coffee and one of Karen's expensive candles. Vanilla something. $80 for a candle that somehow still made the house smell tired. The Delta card declined, Emily snapped. And Target, and Mom's Visa. Karen folded her arms. "You froze the accounts." I shut the front door slowly behind me. Didn't rush, didn't raise my voice. That seemed to upset her even more. "You could at least answer me, Daniel." I looked at the kitchen clock. 7:14 a.m. Normally by then I'd already be upstairs showering before trying to sleep a few hours. Same routine for years. Work nights, come home exhausted, keep everybody else comfortable. Somewhere along the line, I stopped noticing how normal that had become. I set my lunchbox on the counter. Then I pulled the thick manila folder from underneath my arm and laid it on the kitchen island between us. Emily frowned first. Karen looked confused. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." She flipped it open impatiently. The first page was a bank statement. The second was another. Then printed screenshots, credit card balances, online purchases, resort charges, cash advances. I watched the color slowly leave her face. Emily leaned over her shoulder. "Mom." Karen slammed the folder shut. "Why are you spying on me?" That almost made me laugh. Spying. Like checking the accounts tied to my own paycheck was some kind of invasion. "You added Emily to 2 cards without telling me. She needed emergency access." Emily crossed her arms. "I'm literally family." I nodded slowly. "Apparently." Karen opened the folder again, faster this time, angry now. "You printed everything." "Pretty much." "You went through my purchases." I leaned against the counter, carefully trying not to aggravate my back. "Karen, there's $39,000 in credit card debt. That's not all mine." I looked at Emily. She immediately threw both hands up. "Why are you looking at me?" "Because half the charges came from Sephora Airbnb weekends, concert tickets, DoorDash, and online shopping at 2 in the morning. But I didn't say that out loud. "Not yet." Karen straightened herself up like she was preparing for court. "Families don't hide money from each other." There it was. I'm sorry. Not we got carried away. Not even. Let's figure this out. Just blame. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper from the credit union. I changed my direct deposit 3 weeks ago. Karen blinked. "What?" "The paycheck hit the new account yesterday morning." Emily stared at me. "You moved your money." The way she said "you" made something cold settle in my chest. "Not our money. Not the household money. Mine. Only now it mattered because access disappeared." Karen shook her head like she couldn't process what she was hearing. "You froze every account over a few shopping charges." "A few." She flipped the folder shut again. "Oh my God, Daniel, people use credit cards." "You took a cash advance in Scottsdale." Neither of them spoke. That silence told me more than the paperwork ever did. Emily looked toward Karen too quickly. Karen recovered first. "My cousin lives there." "You've never mentioned visiting Scottsdale before last year. So now I need permission to travel." "No," I said quietly. "But I'd like to stop finding out about things after they happen." The kitchen got still. The refrigerator hummed behind us. Somewhere upstairs, the heat kicked on with that rattling sound our furnace had made for years. Emily suddenly sighed dramatically and dropped into a chair. "Dad, you always fix everything. Why are you acting like this?" That one hurt. Not because she sounded cruel. because she sounded sincere. Like my entire purpose in that house had become cleaning up financial messes nobody even felt guilty creating. Karen rubbed her forehead. You embarrassed me today. I almost asked how she thought I felt discovering hidden debt after spending 12-hour shifts repairing machines older than some of the guys I worked with. Instead, I just said, I met with a financial advisor last week. Her head snapped up. You what? And a lawyer. Now she looked scared. Actually scared. Not angry, not offended. Scared. Emily stood back up. Mom said you'd never notice anyway. The second the words came out, her eyes widened. Karen turned toward her sharply. Emily! But it was too late. The room suddenly felt smaller. I looked at Karen, really looked at her. 11 years married. And somehow, the thing that finally cracked my chest open wasn't the debt. It was realizing they'd talked about me behind my back, like I was some harmless idiot too tired to pay attention. Karen stepped closer, softer voice now. Daniel, listen to me. No. She stopped. I think that was the first time I'd interrupted her in years. I grabbed my lunchbox again. Where are you going? She asked. I don't know yet. You can't just walk out. I looked around the kitchen. The white cabinets I refinanced for. The hardwood floor I installed myself one Thanksgiving week. The refrigerator covered in magnets from vacations I paid for. And somehow none of it felt like mine anymore. Outside cold wind hit me hard enough to wake me up better than coffee. I got into my Silverado and drove with no destination for almost an hour. By the time I parked outside the Meijer off Wilmington Pike, the sky had turned pale gray. I reclined the seat slightly and shut my eyes. Johnny Cash crackled softly through the speakers. My back ached. My hand smelled like machine grease. And for the first time in 11 years, I realized I felt calmer sitting alone in a freezing parking lot than I did inside my own house. I woke up in the Meijer parking lot around 10:30 with my neck twisted sideways and my left foot numb. For a second, I forgot where I was. Then I saw the frost creeping along the edge of the windshield and remembered everything all at once. Karen yelling. Emily holding those declined cards. The folder on the kitchen counter. I sat there a while with the truck idling low heater barely working because I kept putting off repairs on myself while fixing everything else around me. Typical, I guess. Across the parking lot, an older couple loaded groceries into a Buick while arguing about paper towels. Nothing serious, just old married people bickering. I watched them longer than I should have. There's something strange about realizing ordinary problems suddenly look comforting. By 11, I was sitting in a Bob Evans booth near Miller Lane, with bad coffee and receipts spread across the table like evidence in a courtroom. The waitress called me Han 3 different times. She looked about 70 herself and moved slowly from table to table with a coffee pot in one hand. You okay, sweetheart? She asked quietly while topping mine off. Long night. Ain't that always the way? I gave her a tired smile. Outside, the Ohio sky looked flat and colorless. Snowmelt dripped from the edge of the restaurant roof in slow, steady taps. I started going through the statements again. At first, when I'd noticed money disappearing months earlier, I blamed inflation. Everybody my age does that now. Groceries doubled. Gas climbed. Insurance got ridiculous. It always felt like something. Then I started seeing patterns. Small charges at first, then bigger ones. Resort deposits, spa packages, plane tickets. Things that didn't match the stories Karen told me. I leaned back slowly and rubbed my face. The weird thing was, part of me still wanted a reasonable explanation. That's the embarrassing truth nobody tells you about betrayal at my age. You don't want revenge first. You want relief. You want somebody to tell you you're not about to lose the life you spent years building. I stared down at one Scottsdale charge again. 3 nights. Luxury suite. 2 guests. I remembered exactly what Karen told me last fall. My cousin's health hasn't been good. I believed her immediately. Never even questioned it. Because that's what I did. I trusted first and thought later. That habit probably cost me half my life. A memory came back suddenly. Karen dancing barefoot in our kitchen about 8 years earlier, while an old Keith Urban song played from her phone. We'd painted the cabinets that weekend. There was paint on her cheek, and she grabbed my hands trying to pull me into dancing with her. Back then, she used to laugh easier. Or maybe I just heard it more. Another memory hit right after that. Last year, when I messed up my shoulder at work, Karen slept in a recliner beside me for 2 nights because lying flat hurt too much. She brought me pain pills on schedule, made soup I never even asked for. That's the part people don't understand. Bad marriages usually aren't bad every minute. That's why people stay. I looked back down at the Scottsdale receipt. Then I pulled out my phone. The resort answered on the 3rd ring. "Good afternoon, Desert Palms Resort." "Hi," I said casually. "I'm trying to confirm a reservation from earlier this year. I think my wife handled it." A few minutes later, after enough pretending and fumbling around, I got the information I needed. Terrence Hall. The name landed in my stomach like cold metal. I knew exactly who he was. Owner of Hall Family Auto over in Beaver Creek. The same dealership where Karen bought her white Lexus SUV 2 years ago. I hung up slowly. For a full minute, I just stared out the restaurant window. Then, like a complete idiot, I immediately started making excuses for her. Maybe separate rooms. Maybe business friendship. Maybe she lied about the cousin because she knew I'd complain about the spending. Your brain does amazing gymnastics when your heart's terrified. By 1 in the afternoon, I found myself driving across town toward Hall Family Auto without even fully deciding to. The giant American flag near the dealership whipped hard in the wind. Rows of shiny trucks lined the lot. And there she was, Karen, standing near the service entrance with Terrence Hall beside her. I parked across the street near a tire shop and watched through my windshield. They weren't kissing, weren't touching. Honestly, that would have been easier. No, they were laughing. Comfortable, relaxed. Karen touched his arm while talking, and I realized I hadn't seen her smile like that around me in a long time. Not fake polite smiling. Real smiling. The kind that reaches the eyes. Something inside me folded inward quietly. I drove away before they saw me. About an hour later, I ended up at Marty Russo's garage out in Huber Heights. Marty had owned Russo Plumbing for almost 30 years before retiring. These days, he mostly fixed old motorcycles and yelled at cable news inside a freezing garage that smelled like motor oil and coffee grounds. He looked up when I walked in. "Well, damn," he said. "You look like somebody just told you beer causes cancer. Feels worse than that." He handed me a folding chair. I told him everything. Not dramatically, just straight through. The debt, the cards, the resort, Terrence. Marty listened without interrupting, which honestly made it worse somehow. When I finally finished, he took a long sip of coffee and shook his head slowly. "Danny, what? If somebody spends $800 on decorative pillows, you're not in a marriage." I almost smiled despite myself. "You're sponsoring a lifestyle." That one actually made me laugh. A short, ugly laugh, but still. Then the laugh disappeared almost immediately, and I had to look away, because my eyes suddenly burned. Marty pretended not to notice. Good friend. He fiddled with a wrench on the workbench before speaking again. "You know what your problem is. Probably several things. You think being needed is the same thing as being loved." That shut me up. Because deep down I knew he was right. Around sunset I drove back toward home. Snow clouds rolled low across the highway. Old Merle Haggard played softly through the radio static. When I stopped at a red light near the dealership again, I saw Karen's Lexus pulling out of the lot. Terrence leaned through her driver's side window saying something that made her laugh. And sitting there at that light, watching my wife smile at another man the way she used to smile at me. I think that was the exact moment denial finally died. For 10 days, I said nothing. That probably sounds strange to some people. Maybe weak. But when you spend most of your life avoiding conflict, silence becomes instinct. You tell yourself you're waiting for the right moment. The truth is, you're scared that once certain words get spoken out loud, your whole life changes shape. So I watched. I paid attention. And once I started paying attention, I saw things I should have noticed years ago. Karen suddenly taking phone calls outside. Emily getting defensive anytime money came up. The way Karen angled her phone away from me now. Tiny things. But once your eyes open, they stay open. I barely slept that week. Mostly sat awake in the living room at night, while the television played old reruns nobody was actually watching. Sometimes Karen would come downstairs around midnight for herbal tea and act almost normal. That was the worst part. Normal. One night she even asked, "You want me to wash your work jackets this weekend?" Like our marriage wasn't quietly bleeding out in the next room. I kept thinking about what Marty said. You think being needed is the same thing as being loved. The more I replayed that sentence, the sicker I felt. By the second Friday, snow had started coming down hard again. Thick, wet flakes sticking to everything. I got home from work around 7:30 that morning and immediately saw a black Mercedes parked halfway down our street. Terrence. This time I didn't drive away. I pulled into the garage quietly and shut the truck off. Then I sat there in silence. The garage smelled like cold concrete motor oil and old cardboard boxes. Snow tapped softly against the garage door. Somewhere inside the house I could hear muffled laughter. Not loud. Comfortable. Familiar. That sound stayed with me longer than anything else. About 20 minutes later, the door from the kitchen opened. Terrence stepped into the garage carrying a foil-covered plate. He stopped the second he saw me sitting there in the truck. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he slowly shut the door behind him. Well, he muttered quietly, "This is probably overdue." I stepped out of the truck. Up close, he looked older than I expected. Mid-60s, maybe. Expensive coat. Gray hair trimmed neatly. Tired eyes. Not some slick movie villain. Just a man. Which somehow made everything worse. Terrence lifted the plate awkwardly. Karen made lasagna. I stared at him. He looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Finally, he sighed. "She told me things between you two were basically finished." I laughed once under my breath. Not because anything was funny. "That what she told you?" "She said you checked out years ago." I shoved my hands into my coat pockets before I did something stupid. Terrence shook his head slowly. "Look, I'm not trying to disrespect you. You're sleeping with my wife." His face tightened immediately. "Fair point." Before either of us could say another word, the kitchen door flew open. Karen. The second she saw us standing there together, all the color drained from her face. "Daniel." I know. 2 words. That was it. And somehow they hit harder than screaming ever could. Karen looked at Terrence desperately. "Can you just give us a minute?" He hesitated, then nodded once and walked toward his car without another word. Snow crunched beneath his shoes the whole way down the driveway. Karen wrapped both arms around herself against the cold. "How long?" she whispered. 10 days. Her eyes widened. "You knew." I nodded. "And you just watched me." I wanted to see how long you could lie to my face. That one landed. She looked away immediately. For a few seconds, all we could hear was wind rattling against the side of the house. Then everything came out at once. Karen crying, apologizing, defending herself, blaming me. Sometimes all in the same sentence. "You stopped talking to me years ago. I worked nights. You were never really here. I was paying for this house." That's not the same thing as being a husband. That one echoed in the garage. I stared at her. And honestly, part of me thought maybe she wasn't completely wrong. That's what made it complicated. I had disappeared into routine somewhere along the way. Work, bills, sleep, repeat. Safe, predictable, quiet. But another part of me kept thinking, you don't fix loneliness by humiliating somebody behind their back. Karen wiped her eyes hard. I got scared, Daniel. Of what? Getting older. Feeling invisible. Feeling like my life was already over. I looked at her for a long moment. There it was. The real thing underneath everything else. Fear. Not just greed, not just selfishness. Fear. But fear can still destroy people. The kitchen door opened again. Emily stepped into the garage wearing slippers and one of Karen's hoodies. She looked from me to her mother. "Oh my God," she muttered. "Seriously?" Karen immediately snapped, "Go inside." But Emily crossed her arms instead. "Mom shouldn't have to beg you for attention." I looked at her slowly. "Excuse me. You checked out forever ago." I felt something shift inside me then. Not explosive anger. Just years of exhaustion finally finding words. "I paid your college tuition." Emily rolled her eyes. "You always bring that up." "I co-signed your apartment." "Because you offered." "I bought you a car after you wrecked the first one." Karen quietly said, "Daniel." But I couldn't stop now. "I covered your emergency room bills when you didn't have insurance." Emily shrugged. "Nobody asked you to." Silence. Real silence. The kind that changes relationships permanently. Even Emily seemed to realize it immediately afterward. But it was too late. I looked at this girl I'd helped raise since she was 17. Christmas mornings, graduation parties, late-night phone calls when she locked herself out somewhere. And suddenly I understood something painful. Being useful is not the same thing as being loved. Karen started crying harder now. Not dramatic crying, just defeated. I reached up slowly and slid my wedding ring off my finger. For years I barely noticed it anymore, just part of my hand. I walked past both of them into the kitchen. The family photo from our Gatlinburg trip still sat beside the coffee maker. Karen smiling, Emily making bunny ears behind my head. I set the ring carefully beside the frame. Karen stopped in the doorway behind me. "Please don't do this." I looked around the kitchen one last time. The magnets on the fridge. The half-dead plant near the sink. My work boots leaving melted snow across the floor. And suddenly I felt tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. I turned toward her quietly. "I thought anger would end this marriage," I said. My voice barely sounded like mine anymore. But honestly, Karen, I think it was exhaustion. The first thing my lawyer said to me was, "Daniel, I need you not to panic." Which is never a sentence that leads anywhere good. His office sat above a small insurance agency in downtown Dayton. Nothing fancy. Brown carpet, cheap coffee machine in the corner, a framed Bengals poster hanging crooked behind his desk, like nobody had touched it since 2009. His name was Leonard Pike, mid-50s, calm voice, kind eyes. The kind of guy who probably spent half his career explaining terrible situations to exhausted people. He slid a document across the desk toward me. "You recognize this." At first glance, it looked like every other stack of mortgage paperwork I'd signed over the years. Then I saw the amount. My stomach tightened. "It's a second mortgage application." I stared at him. "What?" Leonard folded his hands together. "Submitted about 4 months ago." I kept reading. "Home equity loan. Large amount." My name signed at the bottom. Except it wasn't my signature. Not really. Close enough maybe if somebody glanced quickly. But wrong. The D in Daniel curled differently. The line under Mercer looked shaky. I felt heat climb slowly up my neck. She tried to borrow against the house. Leonard nodded carefully. "Looks like the application stalled before final approval. But there are enough irregularities here that I wanted to ask whether you authorized any of this." "No." The word came out immediately. Firm. No hesitation. Still, saying it out loud made me feel sick. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my face hard. 11 years married. And now I was sitting in a lawyer's office, studying forged signatures like some stranger's life. Leonard spoke gently. "If this turns into fraud litigation, things can get ugly fast." "What does ugly mean?" "Court delays, frozen assets, investigations." I closed my eyes briefly. The house. That stupid house. I spent years fixing gutters, replacing pipes, patching drywall, repainting rooms. Every overtime shift I worked went into that place. Now it felt radioactive. Leonard must have seen something on my face because his tone softened further. I'm not telling you to pursue criminal charges. I'm telling you to protect yourself. Protect yourself. At 57 years old, that sentence hit differently than it would have at 30. Because by now, most men my age are tired. You don't want war. You want peace. The problem is peace gets expensive when people mistake your patience for weakness. Outside the office, freezing rain had started falling lightly across downtown. I sat in my truck afterward for nearly 20 minutes without turning the key. Finally, I called Karen. She answered immediately. "Daniel, we need to talk." Her voice dropped instantly. "Okay." No attitude this time. No yelling. Just fear. An hour later, we sat across from each other inside a small diner off Route 48. The lunch crowd had mostly cleared out. Country music played softly overhead, while an older waitress refilled coffee cups nobody was drinking from. Karen looked exhausted. No makeup. Eyes swollen. For the first time in years, she looked closer to the woman I married than the woman she became. "I never meant for things to go this far," she said quietly. I stared out the window at sleet hitting parked cars. "How far exactly?" She swallowed hard. I was scared. There's that word again. It's the truth. I finally looked at her. And maybe because I was tired or old or lonely, part of me still wanted to believe her. That's the dangerous thing about long marriages. Your heart remembers old versions of people even when reality changes. Karen wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "After your accident last year, something changed." I frowned slightly. "When your shoulder got hurt, you stopped talking, stopped laughing. You'd come home and just stare at the television." I didn't answer because she wasn't completely wrong. She looked down at the table. I started feeling invisible too. The sleet outside thickened. For a few minutes, we actually talked like normal people again. Not enemies. Not lawyers and defendants. Just two tired adults sitting in a diner trying to figure out where everything went wrong. And honestly, that almost broke me more than the affair did. Because for 10 minutes it felt fixable. Then Emily ruined it. The diner bell above the entrance jingled, and she walked in carrying her phone and car keys. She stopped when she saw us together. "Oh," she muttered. Karen immediately looked nervous. Emily, not now. Emily slid into the booth anyway. "What's going on?" "Nobody invited you," I said. She ignored me and looked at Karen instead. "Did you tell him about Florida?" Karen's face changed instantly. Not dramatic. Just a tiny flash of panic. My stomach tightened again. "What, Florida?" Emily froze. The silence answered before either of them spoke. Karen shut her eyes briefly. "Emily." But Emily already realized she'd stepped in it. I leaned back slowly. "What, Florida?" Karen looked trapped now. Finally, she whispered, "It wasn't finalized." I felt cold all over. "What wasn't finalized?" Neither answered. Then pieces started connecting in my head on their own. Retirement discussions last year. Karen suddenly pushing warm weather living. Talking constantly about simplifying. Selling the house. Jesus Christ. I looked directly at her. "You were planning this." "No. You were planning to move after I retired." Karen's eyes filled immediately. "Daniel, please. And would I just bankroll everything until I become inconvenient? That's not fair." I laughed softly. Not happy laughter. The kind people make when something finally becomes too obvious to ignore. Emily suddenly got defensive. "You act like Mom's some criminal." I turned toward her slowly. She forged mortgage paperwork. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. Karen started crying quietly now, shoulders trembling. For a second, I almost reached across the table for her hand out of pure habit. That scared me more than anything. Because even after everything, some part of me still wanted to comfort the person hurting me. Later that evening, I drove out to Marty's garage again. He listened quietly while tightening bolts on an old Harley engine. Finally, he wiped his hands with a rag. "Danny." "What?" "There's a difference between mercy and volunteering to drown." Simple sentence. but it stayed with me. That night, I sat alone in my Silverado outside the house, while freezing rain ticked softly against the windshield. The weather radio kept warning about black ice overnight. Inside the house, lights glowed warm behind the curtains. My house, my marriage, my life. And sitting there in the dark, I kept thinking about how many years a man can slowly disappear before anybody notices he's gone. By the time we listed the house, the snow had mostly melted. Ohio looked ugly that time of year. Gray grass, muddy yards, piles of black snow shrinking beside parking lots. Everything halfway between winter and spring. Fitting, honestly. Karen and I barely spoke unless lawyers forced us to. The accounts stayed separated. The divorce paperwork moved forward slowly, painfully like dragging furniture across concrete. Emily still lived in the house, though. Now she mostly stayed upstairs when I was around. Every now and then, I'd hear her bedroom door shut after I came home, followed by muffled phone conversations that stopped the second I walked by. The whole house felt tense and temporary, like people waiting for a storm to finish passing. One evening, Marty came over while I was patching nail holes near the staircase. He looked around the living room and whistled softly. You know, he said this place looked a lot bigger before everybody started lying in it. I shook my head despite myself. You ever serious? Once in 1987. Didn't care for it. That man probably saved my sanity without even realizing it. The realtor scheduled the open house for a Sunday afternoon. Karen insisted on being there. I don't want strangers going through my things alone. I almost reminded her it stopped feeling like our house months ago, but I let it go. By noon, the place smelled like lemon cleaner and staged politeness. Karen spent nearly 2 hours preparing herself like guests were arriving for a dinner party, instead of a public viewing of our collapsing marriage. Hair done. Nice sweater. Makeup perfect. Trying desperately to look like a woman whose life wasn't coming apart room by room. I watched quietly from the kitchen while she adjusted decorative pillows for the 3rd time. Funny thing was, Marty's joke kept replaying in my head. You're sponsoring a lifestyle. A little after 1, the realtor arrived with brochures tucked under her arm. Then the strangers started coming. Young couples. Retired people. One military family with 2 loud little boys running through the hallway. I stood near the back patio doors most of the afternoon trying to stay invisible. That's when I noticed Karen checking her phone repeatedly. Nervous. Anxious. At 1:42 p.m., the doorbell rang again, and Terrence Hall walked in. The second Karen saw him, all the color drained from her face. Oh no. Not anger. Panic. Real panic. Terrence looked confused immediately. He glanced around at the crowd wandering through the house holding real estate flyers. What's going on? He asked quietly. Karen rushed toward him near the entryway. We need to talk outside. But it was already too late. The realtor noticed tension instantly. So did half the people standing nearby pretending not to notice. Terrence frowned. You said he moved out. That sentence landed like a bowling ball in the middle of the room. Karen lowered her voice sharply. Please. I stayed where I was, near the kitchen. Terrence finally saw me standing there. His expression changed immediately. Not smug. Not proud. Just uncomfortable. Again. Funny how affairs seem exciting right up until daylight hits them. Karen grabbed his arm. Can we not do this here? Terrence pulled away gently. What exactly are we doing here, Karen? The room felt quieter now. One older couple suddenly became very interested in the dining room curtains. The military dad pretended to study crown molding while clearly listening. Karen's voice started shaking. I was going to explain everything. When? No answer. Terrence rubbed his forehead slowly. You told me the divorce was basically done. Karen looked toward me briefly like she wanted help. That almost made me laugh. Terrence lowered his voice further. Then your daughter calls me this morning, asking if I can help financially, because the accounts got frozen. Now even the realtor looked uncomfortable. Karen whispered, Terrence. No, seriously, what is happening? Emily appeared halfway down the stairs at exactly the wrong moment. Mom. Terrence looked at her, then back at Karen. You told her to call me. Emily immediately realized she'd walked into a disaster. Karen's composure finally cracked. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Terrence stared at her for several long seconds. Then he asked the question I'd been asking myself for weeks. How long were you planning to keep everybody lying to each other? Nobody answered. Outside wind rattled the bare tree branches against the front windows. The whole house suddenly felt small. Terrence looked toward me again. And to his credit, he actually seemed ashamed. Not enough to stop the affair, obviously, but enough to understand what this moment really was. Karen stepped closer to him desperately. You said you cared about me. Terrence exhaled heavily. I cared about the version of this situation you described. That one cut deep. You could see it hit her physically. Not loud, not dramatic, just devastating. One of Karen's older friends from down the street had wandered in during all this. Linda Carver. Widow, late 60s. Nice woman. She stood near the foyer, holding a brochure awkwardly. Finally, she looked at Karen and said quietly, Daniel was always the one shoveling everybody's driveways after storms. Simple sentence, but I watched Karen's face crumble after hearing it. Because that's the thing about communities when you get older. People notice more than you think. Who shows up? Who helps? Who quietly carries things without asking for credit? Karen sat down hard on the edge of the staircase. For the first time since all this started, she looked less angry than lost. I didn't mean for everything to become about money, she whispered. Nobody responded. Tears rolled down carefully applied makeup now. She swallowed hard. I got scared. Terrence looked exhausted suddenly. You need more help than I can give you. Then he left. Just like that. No screaming. No movie speech. Honestly, that made it sadder. Karen watched the front door close behind him. And I think that was the exact second reality finally caught her. Not when the accounts froze. Not when I moved out emotionally. Right then. The realtor quietly approached me near the kitchen. Daniel, she whispered carefully. We received a strong cash offer about 20 minutes ago. I nodded once. Karen overheard. Slowly she looked up at me. Where am I supposed to go? The room stayed silent, waiting for my answer. I looked at the woman I spent 11 years trying to protect from discomfort. And for the first time in a long time, I answered honestly. Probably the same place you expected me to go once I stopped being useful. Karen shut her eyes. Another young couple walked through the living room discussing paint colors like none of us existed. And standing there, watching strangers imagine their future inside what used to be my life. I realized selling a house feels a little like attending your own funeral. 6 months after the house sold, I was living in a 1-bedroom condo in Kettering, with beige walls, thin carpet, and a coffee maker that sounded like it was coughing every morning. And honestly, for a while the silence bothered me more than the fighting ever did. That surprised me. You spend enough years around noise, tension becomes part of your nervous system. You start expecting slammed cabinets, sharp tones, passive-aggressive sighs from the next room. The first week alone, I kept waking up around 2 a.m., thinking I heard somebody arguing downstairs. But there was nobody there. Just an old refrigerator humming softly in a quiet kitchen. Spring finally reached Ohio sometime in April. Rain replaced snow. The trees outside my condo slowly turned green again. Kids rode bikes through the parking lot after school, while retired couples walked little dogs around the sidewalks in the evenings. Life kept moving whether I was ready or not. Most mornings, I sat near the window drinking coffee before work, while old country songs played low through a cheap Bluetooth speaker Marty bought me for my birthday. Your truck radio sounds like a dying raccoon, he'd said. The man had a gift for insults that somehow felt supportive. I started cooking again too. Nothing impressive. Eggs, chili, sandwiches, frozen lasagna when I got lazy. Turns out feeding one person feels strange after years of automatically buying enough groceries for a whole household. The first time I went shopping alone, I stood staring at family-sized cereal boxes like an idiot for almost 2 minutes. Little things hit harder than expected. One Saturday morning, I reached for my wallet automatically, before realizing nobody else's card was attached to my account anymore. No hidden charges. No panic checking balances before payday. No knot in my stomach every time the phone buzzed. Just quiet. It took me a while to trust that feeling. Karen texted occasionally. At first it was practical things. Insurance paperwork. Forwarding addresses. Questions about taxes. Then eventually the messages changed. Hope you're doing okay. Saw your truck near Dorothy Lane yesterday. Sorry about everything. The late-night texts were always the hardest, usually around midnight. Short, lonely messages from someone suddenly sitting alone with consequences. One night she wrote, "I miss talking to you." I stared at the message for almost 10 minutes before putting the phone face down on the table. Because the truth was, I missed talking to the old version of her too. The woman who danced barefoot in our kitchen years ago. The woman who sat beside me after my shoulder injury, making sure I took pain medication on time. That woman existed once. But somewhere along the line, fear and comfort and resentment slowly swallowed her whole. And if I was being honest with myself, work and exhaustion swallowed parts of me too. Emily never apologized. Not once. At first that aided me. Then one afternoon Marty said something that shifted my thinking. We were sitting outside a bait shop near Cedar Creek Lake while he complained about gas prices and modern country music. "Danny," he said, opening a soda, "sometimes people can't apologize, because then they'd have to admit who they've been." That stayed with me. I stopped waiting after that. Around early May, Marty tricked me into joining some senior travel group out of Beaver Creek. I found out afterward he'd signed my name up without asking. "You're welcome," he said proudly. "I'm not joining a bus tour full of strangers. You already worked 30 years with forklift mechanics. You'll survive retirees." I resisted twice, maybe 3 times. Truth was starting over at 57 feels embarrassing. Like everybody can somehow smell failure on you. But eventually, I gave in and went to one of the group dinners at a little Italian restaurant near Centerville. That's where I met Linda. Not Karen's neighbor Linda. Different Linda. Widowed. 62. Former school secretary. Sharp sense of humor. I accidentally apologized after bumping her chair while sitting down. She looked at me for 2 seconds and said, "You seem like the kind of man who apologizes when other people step on your foot." I laughed harder than I had in months. Not because it was hilarious. Because it was accurate. We talked for nearly 2 hours that night. Nothing dramatic. No magical movie moment. Just conversation. Normal conversation. And driving home afterward, windows down, warm spring air coming through the truck, I realized something important. Peace doesn't always arrive like fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like drinking coffee without anxiety, unlocking your front door without bracing yourself emotionally, checking your bank account and feeling nothing except relief. One Sunday morning in June, I sat at my small kitchen table, shredding old joint credit card offers, while Merle Haggard played softly from the speaker near the sink. Sunlight came through the blinds in thin golden lines across the counter. Simple moment. Ordinary moment. But after the last year, ordinary suddenly felt valuable. I leaned back in the chair and looked around my little condo. No fancy kitchen island. No giant master bedroom. No expensive candles. But for the first time in years, the place felt calm. Safe. Mine. And sitting there with shredded paper collecting beside my coffee cup, I finally understood something that took me 11 years to learn. Love without respect eventually turns into permission. Permission to be ignored. Permission to be used. Permission to disappear inside your own life. If you've ever stayed quiet just to keep the peace, maybe you understand that feeling too. And if you listened all the way through my story, I appreciate it more than you know. Take care of yourself. Really.